on and so forth.
Anybody attending Solidarity Halifax?
Oh, really?
Hi, yeah. Oh, right. Oh, I was down 20. Where were you then? I just went to... Oh, right. Oh, I was... No, it was still in the hall when I left.
Yes. Okay. Roberta?
Yeah.
Thank you. Welcome to the 5th Annual International Convention of Platypus Society. Today we're going to do introduction and workshop with Solidarity Halifax. They're going to do a presentation first, then I'll do one of my own follow-up questions, and we'll open up for Q&A. I will introduce Solidarity Halifax. I'm sorry. Sorry, I'm a little fussed.
No problem. My name is Lesley Thompson. I'm originally from Newfoundland, but I live in Halifax right now. I work in the labor movement as a political communications officer, and in my spare time, I work with Solidarity Halifax.
My name is David Bush. I am a Canadian activist and writer. I'm mostly based in Halifax, although currently I live in Hamilton, Ontario. I'm a sessional lecturer at the McMaster's University School of Labor Studies.
Great. So we're going to ask your indulgence to talk about a very modest project in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is a city of how many? 350,000 on the east coast of Canada. Our project is a membership-based, non-sectarian, democratic, anti-capitalist organization in Halifax. We take our commitment to non-sectarian politics very seriously, and our goal is essentially to create an organization that unites the left in Halifax rather than divides it. Our presentation, I'm going to loosely just talk about what our organization does very briefly. What's interesting is, I think, sort of our creation myth, our foundation story, which Dave is going to talk about. I should mention that Dave is a founding member and was involved in the organization, I guess, in its founding stages. And he's going to talk about the lead up of the official establishment organization as a membership-based organization in November 2011. I should say, for the purposes of the room, I guess Dave is not currently a member, but I am currently an active member. And so he's going to tell the creation story, and I'm going to take it from there and talk about what our organization currently does, how we operate, and also some of our challenges. So currently in Halifax, we have about 40 members. It's a very modest project. Our project is to create opportunities for activism that's rooted in the very concrete conditions of capitalism. We create opportunities for respectful dialogue and debate within our own organization, but also within the broader left community and the broader community in general. We also do education publicly on alternatives to capitalism. That's roughly what we do. I'm going to let Dave talk about how we do about it.
Yeah, so as Lesley mentioned, I'm not currently a member just out of a geographic quirk, but I actually am moving back to Halifax. So I just want to, I'm going to be telling sort of a story of Solidarity Halifax, and I look at it as a story as a microcosm of sort of left reconstitution that's happening all over the globe and happening in Canada. So projects like the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly, Quebec Solidaire, were influential in the discussions of looking at why we need to reconstitute the left in Halifax. But these weren't necessarily in coordination, that this was a project we worked parallel, but I think a broader general leftist crisis. So I think it's important to root this discussion in sort of the concrete conditions of organizing a small town in a particular place in the Maritimes. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with Halifax. It's small, it's 350,000 people. If you're very generous in terms of looking at the city. It's actually much smaller than that. The core of the city is about 150 to 200,000. It's isolated. The next biggest city is Quebec City. That's like a 10-hour drive if you got a lead foot. There's not much else around. There's a couple other major cities by major I mean over 100,000 in New Brunswick, but relatively socially isolated. It has 4 or 5 universities. And the way I like to explain it is that there is a certain cultural and social progressiveness in Halifax that is bigger than you would think due to its size. Like you'd think it would be much smaller. But the reason is because of its geographic location. If you're at all different, if you're leftist or you're queer or anything like this, you think a little different in your small town, you gravitate towards Halifax because there's communities that exist that sort of reflect those values. And the other sort of major important thing is when you look at Halifax, it has a long history of geographic and racial segregation as part of the legacy of slavery, but also the legacy of colonialism. And it's stark, okay? The Black community, the African Nova Scotian community is very much operates within certain geographic boundaries. The white population, the white settler state there has had a long and terrible history right up until the 1990s. I mean, continuing today, but very stark sort of racist legacy that people are still struggling with today. And so I would just like to say that this project came about through organizing. Okay? This is not some sort of theoretical project, but it came from people who were involved in unions, who were involved in the student movement, other social movements, the environmental movement, the feminist movement. And there was, I think, 2 sort of shared frustrations. It was the frustration with a sectarian past, and when you're in a small town, sometimes sex can be like 2 people, or you know, so it's a little different than a bigger city, but definitely shared sectarian past. Yeah, and also a shared frustration with the sort of lack of organization, sustained organization. What I call this sort of alphabet soup of organizations that we've all been a part of. You know, I've been a part of like dozens of organizations that rose and then fell. And this sort of came from, I think, a collapse in the left sort of activity after the anti-war movement, which was actually fairly significant in Halifax. And I think there was a devolution of thought and practice during this period from post-2003 all the way up till 2009. People like categorize this period as definitely a reactionary period. We had a Tory government, the left was in complete disarray, and people who were at all progressive were either gravitating towards the NDP or spinning their wheels in projects that were essentially going nowhere. And in 2009, the New Democratic Party, which is the sort of social democratic party, though less and less so, was elected at the provincial level. And this, I think, caused, in the subsequent years, a profound disappointment with social democracy, which for us was not necessarily a bad thing. And the individuals involved in bringing about this project had a shared sort of understanding that the left was in crisis, yes, but it was not a crisis of resistance or struggle. Resistance, struggle, they happen, okay? They're always going to happen, no matter how bad things are, they're going to happen. It was a crisis of organization. And how are we going to organize ourselves to fight back and not just simply resist or beat back the worst of neoliberalism and so on. And essentially this conformed to our idea of like, there's 3 things lacking. We lack an honest debate on the left. Okay? That's a debate that moves and talks about our political analysis rather than about tactics. There's a lack of strategy that is laid out and is clear and that can be debated. And of course, a lack on the local level of coordinating resources. And this is something that might seem kind of weird, but when you're in a small town, there's a certain amount of money, there's a certain amount of infrastructure that's available, like sound systems, megaphones, and so on, that it just does not make sense to not know where those things are, coordinate their use within the union movement, student movement, and so on. So in 2009, late 2009, early 2010, the G8 ministers were announced to meet in Halifax at the end of April, G8 finance ministers, and there was a demo planned. And an ad hoc group formed this to basically have a protest and a couple of other events. And there was a whole bunch of different people from different social movements, labor movements around the table talking, coordinating this action. And we specifically did not talk about politics because we, A, didn't have the room to do that in terms of time, but also we realized if we did talk about politics, that this little ad hoc group would fall apart. So that protest was relatively successful from the organizers' perspectives. It did what it needed to do. But more importantly, it solidified certain relationships around the table. And I think people came to the understanding that we should actually be talking about politics and working together. This makes sense. And that we are, I think, all saw sort of these three lacks, these no strategy, no coordination, and no honest debate as something that we needed to address. So a smaller group after like the summer, there's people who went to Toronto during the G20, and we did some solidarity demos in Halifax as well. And sort of in the summer of that period, we realized we wanted to continue to build on those relationships. So a smaller group of people organized a conference talking about how do we, the left, people who identify as the left in this town, fight back in this period of reaction, like when the right is winning and implementing all these reforms. And how do we get beyond what we would qualify as the triage mentality on the left, always putting out the worst fires and never really moving beyond defensive battles. So there was about 120 people who came. And it was it was well attended, a pretty good conference. And from that, we had another group. We had a voluntary coordinating committee to organize another conference several months later. This was November 2010, and the next conference would be in March. And this conference dealt more with what is the left, like trying to tease out some of the political debates about how we define the left. Okay. And how can we orient towards things like the religious movements, environmental movements, and then how do people in the organizing in the anti-poverty movement and student movement, how are they organizing? What kind of lessons can we learn from that? And out of that, we developed a failed idea, but sort of long-term successful idea of like creating a network of working groups that coordinated people who are interested in similar projects. So people that, I think there was like a writing group, a group working on environmental stuff, a group doing postal solidarity stuff and things like this. Almost all of those groups failed except for the postal workers campaign, which was very successful in what it was trying to do. It started organizing well before the postal rotating strikes and lockout that happened in early 2011, May. Spring, yes, thank you. The postal workers in Canada went on a rotating strike in the spring of 2011, and then were locked out by their employers.
And we're legislated back to work.
And they're legislated back to work. But what we were able to do with this campaign was turn a defensive struggle into an offensive struggle. We went door to door. We hit over a couple of thousand houses. We put up thousands and thousands of posters. On our door-to-door campaign, we were able to work with postal workers and then draw them into this Solidarity Halifax project. And we changed the level of debate on a very localized level. And we were able to coordinate some of our resources nationally. So the types of graphic designs, websites, and things that were coming out of Halifax were used across the country. However, by and large, this idea of a sort of a loose network failed. But the dynamic tension of that failure, of this trial and error, allowed people to mentally buy into the idea that we needed a more firm organization that was more reflective and accountable. So this idea of basically a membership-based organization came about. And there was a third conference organized in November 2011. Again, something like 80 people showed up, where people talked about organizing experiences and reflected on those, and then this idea of pitching a membership-based organization. A membership-based organization was pitched. And I think this process of trial and error, what it did was it created a positive reception to this organization. So a bunch of people joined, but even people who didn't immediately join were able to have sort of a positive sense of that organization and work with it and understand that they could have good relationships even though they're being members. And on some level, it changed the discussion and made a new reference point on a local level. So to the left of the NDP, which had been a space that was virtually unoccupied, was created, and this space was, I think, fulfilled by Solidarity Halifax. And I think more importantly, often when we talk about organization and creating new organizations and forming them, we miss a little piece of the picture, which is we created not just a new organization, but a new sort of attitude about collective struggle and collective identity. We were able to get people to put both feet in the water. So we were creating a new organization, but creating the attitudes that would allow that organization to flourish. In a sense, it's both creating form and a new practice. And sort of that takes us up to the formation.
Okay. So what do we have currently? What we have currently has been in existence since November 2011. And it's a membership-based dues-paying organization. Our members identify as many things. So we have anarchists, we have feminists, we have social democrats, we have communists, who come together with the goal of creating an organization that unites the left, as I said, rather than dividing it. We're fairly unique on Halifax's left insofar as we also are multi-generational, and I think that's often unique on the left in general. So we have, as members, undergraduate students who are members of their student councils. We have veterans of left movements in Nova Scotia and elsewhere from the 60s and 70s. So we have a broad spectrum of experience of activism and organizing on the left. And we draw from that, insofar as we actively attempt to not repeat the mistakes of the left from the past. What's also important about our membership is that our members don't represent any particular organization, although it's apparent by virtue of looking at who's part of our organization. We have members who are deeply involved in other progressive left organizations in Halifax, but no one's there wearing a particular hat. So I'm a staff person in the labor movement. One of our members is the president of the Labor Council. So we have people with their feet in the door in all sorts of different left organizations. No one represents those organizations in Solidarity Halifax, but one thing we realized is that by having this representation in other groups in Halifax, we have the opportunity to leverage that power in those other groups. And we hope ultimately, and we think we're starting to do it, to push those other groups further to the left, so labor, student unions, for example. And some of our working groups, which I'll talk about in a minute, we take that project on. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about is what we do and how we're structured. What's interesting about our organization is that we feel that we're attending to the sort of crisis in organization that Dave was talking about. So we have mechanisms in place that ensure we're democratic, so we make decisions and everybody makes decisions. We have mechanisms in place that ensure that we don't get mired down in our own internal administration, which was a feature of one particular previous group that had a lifetime in Halifax and then kind of died, which was the Halifax Coalition Against Poverty. I think they got mired down in their own sort of internal business. We have mechanisms in place to ensure that we're a long-term organization. So Dave referred to the fact that we've both been organizing since the 90s, and we've been members of so many organizations that are particularly issues-based and have a very short lifespan. So Solidarity Halifax has mechanisms in place to ensure that we have longevity. And having longevity, an important feature of having longevity is avoiding burnout. So I'll talk about that in a minute. We balance reflection and action, and we make internal education a priority. So basically, Solidarity Halifax is also a response to the fact that too often vibrant organizations and vibrant movements on the left lack the staying power to survive. Because we see the departure of organizers, particular people. We see sectarianism, we see specific focuses on just issues. So our goal as an organization is to overcome these pitfalls through our structure, but also through our practice. So there are three key features to our organization. The first is the general membership meeting. So the general meeting happens once a month and is a space for theory and practice to take place. We're committed to a democratic politics that recognizes the interdependence of action and analysis. We're very rooted in the concrete conditions in Halifax. So our understanding of politics comes through struggle, and we know that our actions must be guided by principled and thoughtful analysis. So our general membership meeting meets once a month. Half of this meeting is dedicated to political discussion. Half of the meeting is dedicated to business. The political discussion, the topics are chosen by our coordinating committee, which I'll talk about in a minute. And the topics are chosen based on what's currently happening in Halifax, what's currently happening in the broader left, or also what current projects various of our working teams are taking on. So for example, in our last general meeting, the worker action team brought the question of Solidarity Halifax's relationship to organized labor and the labor movement to the room. And we asked the question, when, how, and why would Solidarity Halifax implicate itself into the struggles of organized labor? One sort of thing we've done in the organization to tackle these discussions is to explore, we'll generally explore a series of axioms where we establish agreed upon truths about the labor movement would be sort of, unions exist, unions mitigate some of the negative effects of capitalism, unions also have the effect of creating docility amongst their rank and file in terms of political action. So we would go through those axioms and then come out with some guiding principles that will ultimately guide our work when it comes to working in the struggles of organized labor. 5 minutes. Oh, let's see, 7. So essentially, theory and practice takes place in our general meetings. So we have our political discussion and then we make decisions. At all of our general meetings, our work teams make presentations on what they've been up to, and we vote. After our general meetings, we always get together for drinks because that's incredibly important. We have
What do you drink?
That's also incredibly important. We also have a coordinating committee. The coordinating committee has 3 members, each with a tenure of 9 months. There's an election every 3 months, which means we have staggered people come in. Every 3 months, a new member comes into the committee. This avoids activist burnout. This avoids the concentration of too much power amongst specific activists and individuals and leaders, which is a notorious feature of left organizing. And it also ensures new ideas. It also ensures the longevity of the organization insofar as institutional knowledge can be passed on and we have new people coming in every 3 months. The coordinating committee does the thankless work of the organization. They make sure the work teams are working, they make sure people are paying dues. And I should mention it's a dues-paying organization so that Solidarity Halifax is not accountable to the broader labor movement, to any other organizations like students, organizations for our funding, and that's important. I'm going to talk about some of our, because I guess I'm pressed for time, but maybe in question and answer you guys can talk or ask us questions about more about what we do. Our work teams, I'm going to skip to our critical work teams. One of our work teams runs a campaign which has been going on for about a year called Power to the People. Solidarity Halifax recognizes that the Canadian left suffers from an inability to orient itself or speak to those who aren't on the left. Power to the People is a populist campaign that is pitching the idea to the general population to return the private power utility to the hands of the public. Nova Scotia Power was privatized 20 years ago. A Nova Scotia-based company called Emera bought it. Since that time, the power's been going out on an absolutely regular basis. The power rates have been going up, and we see that as a problem. It's a populist campaign which deals with the concrete conditions of people who live in Nova Scotia. It's expensive if you're poor to pay your power bill. So we've been working creatively to pitch this idea of returning the private utility to the hands of the public. And we've actually been doing it quite strategically insofar as we've taken opportunities like various times of rate hikes to go public with this. Very recently, a public skating rink in Halifax called the Oval, a public skating rink, the province offered the naming of it to this company, Emera. Basically just said, hey, do you want to name this public space? Emera said, sure, we'll call it the Emera Oval. So we took that opportunity to run a campaign whereby we decided that we would ask Nova Scotians what they wanted to name the Oval. And we pitched all sorts of ideas, different names based on radical figures in Nova Scotia's past. And we basically ran a campaign whereby we asked Nova Scotians what they wanted to call the Oval, and basically said to them, a private corporation should not be able to put their stamp on a public space. This campaign is interesting in terms of it's got a long-term shelf life. It's already succeeded in sort of two phases of actually putting the question of public ownership back on the table. We had a lot of media success. We actually, successfully had the word anti-capitalist sort of appear in like mainstream publications, but actually returned it to the form of it being a legitimate question once again, whereas for the past 20 years, public ownership of the utility was off the table. That's one of many of our projects. Should I keep going, or should I?
Yeah.
I'll
give it 2 more minutes.
Okay. Should I do our anti-racism, or should I do our... Okay, we have another work team which deals directly with one of the questions that Dave was talking about, which is an incredibly deep-seated institutional racism in Nova Scotia that's led to an incredibly high rate of poverty amongst African Nova Scotian people and also amongst Aboriginal people, mostly Mi'kmaq. Solidarity Halifax takes the question of race and the history of racism incredibly seriously in Nova Scotia, and realizes that we also recognize that members of Solidarity Halifax are largely not from the African Nova Scotian community or from the Mi'kmaq community, and that's for a reason. And in fact, we've been active in trying to actively build relationships with members and activists from those communities, and we realize that that's not the kind of thing that happens overnight. And I think that it tends to something that the left does hastily, just go to these communities and say, hey, you want to get on board with our struggle? Because it would be really great if you were part of our organization. We realize that's very paternalistic, that's not going to happen, and so we have to build these organizations or these relationships very differently. So Solidarity Halifax has also built relationships with radicals from the 60s and 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s in the African and Nova Scotian community, and basically asked them, how can we support you in your struggles? How can we use the skills that we have and the leverage we have to support you in your struggles? And we've answered certain calls, two of which from the African Nova Scotian community. One was to write a series of articles just about racism in Nova Scotia. Another one was basically a commitment to organize a People's History Conference in Halifax, which recognizes a lineage of a radical struggle amongst many communities in Halifax, including marginalized communities. So those are two projects that we're currently taking on to build relationships and address the issue of racism and continued racial segregation in the province. So in that respect, we've acted as real organizers who are doing real solidarity work in a legitimate way that challenges racism. We can wrap up. We've been doing work, I think maybe in the question and answer we can talk about our relationship with social movements, because I know Québec Solidaire has been a particular space for activists to get involved in social movements to go to when those social movements sort of die out. And Solidarity Halifax is also assuming that role, I think, in particular with the I Will Know More movement recently. Do you want to say anything quickly? Because I've gotten through basically half of my notes.
I guess we were just talking, just what, 60 seconds here. Just in terms of reference to this idea of the Utopia program. And we were thinking like, well, how would we orient towards like that kind of question? And I think we sort of came up with this idea, it's like none of the above yet. And I think more sort of the ideas that we look at are it's not Utopia program, it's strategy and method for us at this point. Because this came from an organizing perspective. These the people involved are organized, rooted in social movements, in the local concrete conditions. And we're at the point where I think when this started is that we want to move the debate towards more anti-capitalism, understand what that is, and shift the terrain of the debate. However, then you'll be like, what's anti-capitalism politics do? And I think that what we've sort of talked about is this idea that we're a small organization right now. We're not gonna, it's coming from the Syriza talk. It's we're not taking power. We're not even broaching those questions, and we should be honest about where we are and not necessarily worry about that so much in terms of what does socialism look like to you. Because the politics it's evolutionary. We develop through our struggle. And that individually, I think all the members have a sort of uneven political consciousness and different ideas. And there's a certain conflict within unity, but as this project goes forward, I think those political questions will become sharper and sharper and sharper. So maybe that's a cheap answer, but maybe sometimes cheapness is honesty.
I am extremely impressed in the ability to hear what you guys have built, in the sense of having had experience in the activist lab. It's very rare, sort of even the basic principles that you guys have agreed upon, sort of what we don't want to do. And to tell you the truth, your November 2011 is in this right around Occupy, right? 2 months after Occupy starting. And Occupy also was founded on this grounds of things that we don't want to do. We don't want to do the sectarian, sort of sectarianism, the particular sort of issues that I feel Occupy also represents things we don't want to do that were done in the past. That's something that's similar you guys have. But why I said that I am impressed is because I am actually wondering, because at some point there was talk about we knew that people weren't talking politics. You said this word, and I was very, very curious about what you meant about people not talking politics. So then the question is, since the founding of the organization, since the membership, I really want to know what have been the major disputes? What has been the nature of political disagreement? The organization, is it about whether or not you guys are going to what kind of program will you build? Or is it really because agreeing to just have this kind of minimum task of, we just want to build a network of solidarity organizations and these activities? But my real question is sort of what has been the crux of struggle of political dispute within the organization since its founding?
That's a really good question, and I think it's still early stages. I'm not saying we all get along because there is disagreement, and we actually actively encourage disagreement. But we've been able to navigate it quite well. And I don't sort of want to call out any particular members, the radical worker faction and the labor people are like at loggerheads or whatever, because we acknowledge that and then we try and move beyond it.
I'm curious, what are the issues that make people at a loggerhead, I guess? What have been
Some of the challenges.
Yeah, I mean, right now, I think because we are so young, and I didn't talk about, the organization, we actively recruit. So we have sort of a lot of people that came out of this founding moment who do have this broad experience as activists and organizers in the lab. And then we do actively recruit. So we recruit from people who, people in the student movement who want to do something, people who responded to the Quebec student strike, people who responded to Idle No More and just didn't know where to go, and people who and here's sort of where they end up. So I don't think we're not at the point where we've got these massive political divisions, but we are struggling in terms of maintaining a balance between rigorous political discussion and tending to our internal education. And our membership committee is actually responding to that right now, because what we've noticed recently is that our 1 hour political discussion at our membership meetings is maybe not sufficient to bring up those new members. So two things we've been doing to respond to that. We have a student caucus, which is very active on campus, and they've been holding weekly or bi-weekly discussions on topics like coffee and capitalism. So they've been doing that to sort of do some very specific education on it's similar to what does on campus.
2 coffee breaks.
Yeah, I know, we still but it's, so I think we're tending to our internal education needs by doing, the student group is doing that, but also for our new recruits, we've actually just in the past month or two been organizing sort of internal educationals where we tend to those. So I don't think we're at the point where we've got these big, these big sort of breakdowns or big sources of tension. Because I think that's because we're still actively working through our positions on things. So I talked about the conversation we recently had about labor. We're still actively working through the way in which Solidarity Halifax will implicate itself in workers' struggles. Several months ago, we developed guiding principles for how Solidarity Halifax implicates itself or relates to the Democratic Party, which is in power. Now, these things will probably change. We have an election coming up. Our position to the NDP might change as the concrete conditions of what's going on in Nova Scotia changes, as they start campaigning, stuff like that. So we're still sort of developing, and we've been able to constructively disagree and also build fairly productive relationships.
Okay, open to Danny and then
I just wanted to ask if you could clarify what your response was to the sort of utopian program question. You said neither above, but strategy and method. And when I think of strategy and method, I think implicitly in it there is a goal. There is a strategy. Even if it says it has no goal, it kind of does have one. Anyways, otherwise it doesn't mean anything or something. And I guess I don't know if you could just clarify that.
Yeah, I think you missed the sort of key word there, which was yet. In terms of we don't have a fixed goal, mostly because, and it's hard for me to speak exactly what's going on now, but I think I look at the project as a process through struggle. So as the group will orient towards different campaigns it's running, that it develops a sort of political culture to question what's our line, or what's our approach and our political analysis about sort of let's say, bringing Nova Scotia Power back into public ownership? And what does that allow us to do? And then how does that relate to what we see as anti-capitalist politics? Because on some level, while it would be kind of easy to say, you know, we're a socialist organization and we believe in sort of the nationalization of like heavy industry and so on. You know, heavy industry doesn't exist in Nova Scotia or whatever. You know what I mean? Is that what that does is that sort of, I think, short circuits the sort of better. I think it short circuits a question, which is it's actually not rooting that sort of utopian program into the sort of elements of what struggle look like today in Nova Scotia. Is that all those questions are still up for debate, and to be an effective organization and to draw in all these different organizers, that it's a process of being. I know it's sort of a cheap answer and it's not very clear, but I think that there's, yeah.
And
So this might be another kind of premature question, but I found it really interesting that around your founding moment you posed the question of what is the left? And I'm wondering like how, what followed from that by way of any kind of answer or consideration, and maybe to put a finer point on that, since I imagine there was a lot of sort of general disagreement perhaps, or not not the clearest formulation. You mentioned that you try to push groups to the left. So what does that mean, and what does that look like when you do that?
I think, again, that's like, I think that's more of like, that's what we hope is going to happen. Certainly, we have a worker action committee, and we hope that we will implicate ourselves in worker struggles so that, or in the struggles of organized labor, so that we can push labor further left. And I think we'll be doing that by working with rank and file members, also by filling gaps. I think Dave talked about the way in which the organization, before it was officially founded, implicated itself in the postal workers' strike. I think what we did was quite ingenious insofar as we filled a gap that labor, when it goes on strike, often doesn't do, which is talking to the community. You know, like basically just like making labor's case to the people who use those services. And because strikes are often just, you know, they get really entrenched in the picket line and the relationship of the workers to the employer. And there's been amazing things in Halifax. Everybody had like a "I support my postal worker" poster in their wall, because the organization took this initiative to just, you know, go door to door and talk to people. Whereas, like, also, I mean, labor often, you know, at points of crisis and struggle, you might not have time to do that because you're trying to hold the line. So I think, you know, I mean, that's one of the ways by implicating ourselves in existing progressive groups and trying to nudge them. Maybe it's sort of opportunistic, but I was talking about the members we have who are involved in student politics. There's 5 campuses in Halifax. It's a massive student population. And student councils have the potential, and I mean, I don't know, like it seems to me like there'll be a left-wing student council one year, and then like it will go to the right, and like, you know, like they're subject to the change in the student body. Solidarity Halifax intends to have kind of like, you know, a long lifespan, and if we can sort of get into the way that student organizing happens on campus, and that's already starting to happen, maybe we can push that a little bit. But right now it's pretty premature. Like we're just sort of sussing out our points of pressure and the power that we can leverage in the community.
I would just add, just briefly, like again, we have an uneven individual political consciousness, right? So that individually I could probably answer those questions, and yes, they would probably change over time as I get more bitter when I'm older or something. But you know, I can answer that. But on a collective level, I think that we're still working on. And you know, we had like a little panel debate, what's the left? Like one person talked about if the left is sort of aspirational, one sort of person talked about like left sort of as through a personal lens, and then another person talked about left, what's the left is like, it's to the left of the political party structure, so it's workplace struggles and so on. And I think that those levels of discussion, like those discussions are still happening all the time. So what it means is like, how do you intervene in struggles if you don't know what the left is? I still think that there's a general attitude is that it's easy. Postal workers go on strike or locked out. Well, you support them and you build those relationships. You try to get them to meetings, talk about how this crisis, like is deeper than the individual social movement that people are a part of. It's actually attached to something that's going on with the capitalist system. Not neoliberalism, but with capitalism itself. So on a theoretical level, it's hard to answer, but like actually in practice, it's not that difficult. It's like in the student movement, how do you people intervene to push it more to the left? Well, you support the positive things in terms of that the student movement is doing, giving money to social movements or so on, and trying to talk about how this crisis is more systematic and entrenched than what they're talking about, which is like, and the answer is not social democracy. So it's like both, I don't know, it's hard to answer in theory, but easy to do in practice.
Yeah. There's a question here.
Yeah, I thought that was great. I'm from the Toronto Workers Assembly, and I think there's a lot to learn from what I'm talking about, so I want to hear more about it later. But thinking about this question of utopia and having a more worked out sense of where you're going, because you needed to develop strategy. So obviously some people in the group do have that. They bring it in, they just try to find a way to bring it in. It doesn't sound like they're giving a line. But there seems to be, to me, that there's other ways of doing it that don't require you to have a line. You can use history to raise all kinds of questions about socialism. And you can even have discussions around explicitly socialist ideas where the point isn't to resolve the question. And it seems to me that's kind of a safe way of raising it. But I think probably one of the best ways is what you just answered, that it kind of happens organically. There's a strike on, and the strike is inherently limited because of what unions do. So the question is, what does the left actually have to offer? Mm-hmm. That's more than, and you only have that to offer because you have a large division. So you're actually putting some kind of a class perspective on it. And I think that is how I think you really start moving towards people thinking about something. Can I just say one thing about it? I think one of the really crucial things for the left to do in those cases is not to just be inspirational, but to constantly talk about the limits of what we can do, because that's what politicizes people. They learn they have to go beyond organizationally and in other ways what they're doing.
Do you have a question for the speakers?
No, I just want to.
Well, if I could just respond, I mean, one of the things that we did during the municipal campaign, I guess, when was the municipal election? Maybe, we'll say about a year ago, was because we do implicate ourselves like at particular moments when people are paying attention. But what did we have to offer to that was we held a no candidates meeting. So everyone's having all candidates meetings. Everyone's trying to get behind a candidate, so we decided to have a no candidates meeting and to talk about the notion of the city as being a site for struggle and change, and radical change on the level, like the urban level. And we invited people who'd done municipal organizing in Halifax in the 80s to talk about what they had done during the 80s. We invited actually an African Nova Scotian woman who ran for mayor in Toronto and came in second to come and talk about her experience. But none of the candidates for the municipal election were actually invited, and that was very intentional. So we take opportunities to which exist, postal strike and the municipal election, to sort of offer something different or create a situation where different conversations can happen.
Alex and then the lady.
So one of the things you mentioned is that you're a membership-based organization, but the people in it are where you said they don't have different hats while they're members. As in, like, they're members of other organizations. They're like, there's a history of sectarianism in Halifax. And I just wanted to know, like, how do you navigate that? Because, like, in my experience, join groups that supposedly you can be members of most, and let's have a unity project, and you can just kind of come in and be a member of your other organization, and ultimately they just fail. But the sectarianism just like completely destroys the organization. And I'm just wondering, like, how you guys navigating it? You mentioned that you have structural things in the organization or something else.
I just briefly mentioned that I think that partly relates to the process of how that formed. It wasn't just like one day a bunch of people got together and formed an organization that was like broader, left, blah. It was through a process, and that process was a learning process for everybody involved. Like 100 or so people who drifted in and out of those conferences and like went through this idea of trying to find a network and so on and so forth, is that by the end of that process, people decided to create a new organization, but they also had a mental shift into we should have a different type of practice. Is that jump like both feet into the water into this project, and maybe we have different political orientations, but I'm here and I'm around this table, and that's what I am, and that's the collective that I'm a part of. And even though I'm, like, let's say, in the labor movement or so on, when I'm actually in this organization, that's it. And I think maybe the answer is the process of that happening really clarified those questions in a way that just, if it just was formed the next day, I think it would be completely different.
Yeah, because I think the activist left in Halifax had recently gone through that and had recognized that it was a messy experience and brutally unproductive, and so people are in a position where they're able to put certain things aside out of necessity of what's currently going on. I should also say that I think a lot of people are there, and I can speak for I'll speak for myself. I'm also there because I'm not actually getting what I need in my involvements in other things. So I think we actually have a lot of people who are there like that. People who aren't getting everything they need or feel sort of like they can't do all they want to in other organizations in which they're involved. So it's an opportunity for people to also not just whatever, like suppress their like politics or whatever. I wouldn't even say it's that. It's just about for people to like productively disagree, but also like do stuff that they can't do in other organizations. Your question.
I have to preface this by saying I feel in some ways we're having a similar question asked again and again, which probably speaks to a lot of our experience, collective experience as activists in various situations. So I'm going to ask probably a similar question, but from a slightly different angle. I think in a way, from my experience, both the strength and the weakness of single-issue organisations is that they don't really address the wider issues or join the dots, if you like. And in creating an organisation which brings together a lot of these different issues, then you might be starting to join the dots. But when you start to do that, that's when you can turn people off. So is there a danger in, if you either have to avoid the theory, if you like, and then just focus on the practice, which it's easy to unite people against things, which is what a lot of the practical activism is about. But it's harder to unite people in favour of something, and you did mention right at the beginning alternatives to capitalism, which is more of a positive idea there. But how do you actually, is there a danger that you never actually get very far in developing these ideas and the discussion of ideas, because if you go there too far, then that's what's likely to be divisive, and that's what a lot of organisations find.
I think that, there's always going to be that tension in a project like this or groups like this, and I don't think that should be something that turns people off from this, because as organizations grow, there's going to be all sorts of tension, and it's going to explode and all this stuff, and there'll be all sorts of conflict. But can, depending on your attitude and your practice, that can be a creative process in which it clarifies things and it moves struggle forward, or it can be, if you have the wrong, I think, attitude and practice, it can be sectarian, sort of divisive, and be a sort of net negative for the left wherever that's happening. So it's a little, like, yes, there's that tension, but if there wasn't that tension, then there wouldn't be actual progress, like, in those organizations. It would just be a club.
Yeah. And Solidarity Halifax isn't necessarily a line, but we do have lots of opportunities for people to work. So our work teams, anyone can form a work team. Every work team, all they need is a convener. The convener calls a meeting. If people are interested in coming to that work team, starting a project. Like, it's very, people create their own projects in it. So we currently have seven different work teams. In a month's time, there might be 8, there might be 6. So our projects, are places where people can work on projects they want to work on, basically. And I don't think that turns people off, because you don't have to, the requirement of membership is that you attend general meetings. If you don't, you have to send regrets, that you pay dues, and that you belong to at least one work team. So those are the requirements of membership. So I feel like lots of people can lots of progressive leftists will find something that won't turn them off, basically.
And I'll just say, like, this is my personal sort of position, and it's not reflective of the group or anybody else, but like, when it's an evolutionary process, so it's impossible to say what this organization will be in 3 years, because it's impossible to understand exactly what the struggles will shift and how the organization will respond to those. But I do think that over time, its political analysis will sharpen through struggle. And so it starts off, and this is why I think it's important to think of this as a temporal thing. We don't need to be like Syriza and think, like, what's our program once we take power, because we may take power like maybe 6 months from now. But we have to understand, like, we're a small organization, so we're kind of vague, and then as it grows and develops, like, it will learn through its past practice, and it will sharpen political analysis as it confronts those problems. So I think that there's definitely a tension in there, but my personal opinion is that it will sharpen through the inevitable struggle. And maybe you lose people, maybe you gain people, maybe the line shifts depending on what's being confronted and what the conditions are. But
Can I ask a quick supplementary to that then? Having said that then, how do you avoid the problems of a political analysis sharpening in one particular direction, because there are already people who've come in and already have particular ideas that they've brought in with them, rather than the people who are joining because they want to be involved in this activism, but they haven't necessarily, thought through a lot of the political ideas in a broader sense.
I think, as Dave said earlier on, there really are various levels of political consciousness in the organization, and we're very aware of that, and we tend to it in a really sort of generous, we tend to the organization, and so we actually actively, I would say that if someone was taking their particular political line too far, the coordinating committee might step in and have a conversation and say that, that's not maybe in the best interest of the entire organization. And so it's just sort of navigating this speed of growth, speed of new recruits, new people coming in, trying to bring everybody up together to a degree, as opposed to, focusing all of our energies and projects and politics within a small group of people. And we're very conscious of we want to grow, and so what is needed for us to grow, and that's actually a really humble approach to politics.
it's like it faces every left organization. Like, how quickly do you grow? Do we get like 500 new members in, and then like, what does that mean for that organization? And I don't think that's unique to Solidarity Halifax. It's unique to basically every left group. It's like the pace at which we do this that allows us to grow, but also allows new people to come in and sort of understand the organization and create sort of a democratic practice within that.
Yeah. You had a donor, you had a donor.
You said
Yeah.
hand up for a while.
Yeah.
Oh, I go? Okay.
Yeah, sorry,
So-
no, I did.
Ryan, sorry. Hi. So like, a lot of the emphasis is on education, and education through the actual workings of the group. Like insofar as people are actually going to be politicized through the machinations of Solidarity Halifax, like what sort of like you think that's going to cause problems in terms of like not like expansion, yes, but like how much is Solidarity Halifax ever going to be able to think beyond Halifax, Nova Scotia, just like the struggles of a very regional, very, you know.
I think those are the questions we ask ourselves all the time. Maybe not all the time, but often. And I think we have certain things we need to get beyond before we, expand and start setting up chapters in like Wolfville or PI or whatever. I mean, personally, I think we're very, at the moment, we're deeply implicated in the struggles within the Halifax Regional Municipality. Will we expand? I don't know. I think the work of our anti-racism group is really rooted in Halifax as well, and I think we want to focus a lot of energy actually on doing that work with African Nova Scotian communities and Mi'kmaq communities before it might be reckless to sort of, think about setting up chapters elsewhere before we tackle some of those incredibly important issues. I'm just speculating. So for the time being, I think our scope, it really is Halifax. In our People's History Conference, which we're planning for the fall, we might go a bit beyond and look at some radical histories in Cape Breton. But right now, we're dealing with the concrete conditions of activism, organizing, and people in a particular city.
Again, I'll say this as an individual because there is no organizational, I think, line about this stuff. But like, just even imagining an organization, an anti-capitalist organization in Halifax, if it grows and becomes pretty successful, then yeah, it's going to be confronted with questions of not just speed of growth, but also scale of growth. Like, how do you approach provincial politics? Why? And then you can't move too far ahead of the rest of Canada if the rest of Canada becomes reactionary. Because so it's a question of like, how do you like orient towards the broader Canadian left, I think, and things like this. Like, those questions, I think, are pretty far away, I imagine, in Halifax. That's my understanding. But like, they're real questions. Like, it's important to understand like how you link up and have conversations. And part of my thing is that I've moved, and there's been some people who've been like members and for whatever reason moved away from Halifax. And I find I'm deeply frustrated with the level of struggle in other places in terms of I don't see this type of approach. So I'm in Hamilton, and it's frustrating. Other people I know are in other cities, and they also would like to see organizations that are similar in other cities.
Jeremy?
I've got maybe two connected questions. One building off of Ryan's, and it's more of an observation that I'd like to hear you comment on. It seems like Halifax is always bobbing with currents that happen outside. So like the earlier generations of people in the 70s were deeply influenced by the new communist movement in Quebec. And sort of like blew into Halifax, and movements tried to navigate with these outside forces. The ultra-globalization movement, like when you talk about sectarianism, you're not talking about Marxist sectarians, you're talking about anarchist sectarians, like around, right? So there was a way in which Halifax had to cope, like with this kind of growing movement that came from outside, and then Occupy, and then even Idle No More. In some ways, it rolled into Halifax, and there was a way in which it seemed like one of the first challenges for Solidarity Halifax as an organization is how are we going to deal with this thing that's sort of like coming into the city, and how will we, be able to grow, contribute something to it. So I think there's this question of, the question that Ryan posed, the things coming from the outside, how can Solidarity Halifax not simply bob up and down with, I remember when Occupy blew into Halifax, it was like just us suddenly filled up with like 80 people, came out of nowhere, and then Solidarity Halifax was more proactive than any group that I've experienced in really engaging Occupy, like getting down there and being very engaged with Occupy. But there was a way in which like it was not self-created, like it came from the outside. And so Solidarity, it seems like in these small regional centers there's always this problem of really being limited from the outside. That was sort of the first question. So like how do you discuss this kind of vision, and you have now organizational experience with it? And have they been, to what extent do you think you can control these things, or they'll just kind of like go away on you? And then the second thing is that you've mentioned the intergenerational component of Solidarity Halifax, which is really interesting to me. And I've noticed when we go to events, there's like, multi-generations of people there. But there's also this kind of, you talked about making a break with this legacy. There was a way like you wanted to learn the lessons of the past. So I wanted to know what the lessons of the past that have been learned are, and how you sort of like been able to move beyond it. Because a lot of like the anti-oppression or the anti-racism, you can find antecedents of it in the new communist movement, or some of the people who are in the organization. Like if you were talking about reaching out to African Nova Scotian activists from the 60s and 70s, to sort of tell you what to do in the present. So in a way, it's unclear to what extent you're not. So how does here's the question, how are you working through this past? What are sort of the lessons of it? And I know there's active discussion within the organization. I know this is something you're dealing with, and I'd like to hear you expand on what those discussions are. Sorry.
Two big questions.
We've been here for 2 years and had a lot of questions built up.
Do you want to start with any of that?
I don't think so. I guess I would just say, I'm not going to answer any of your questions. I would say, like struggle bobs up and down in Halifax, but struggle bobs up and down everywhere. And to me, sort of my personal experience in learning a lesson is like, okay, how do I ride out this struggle without necessarily going with the boom-bust cycle of it, and capturing that sort of energy and then sort of infusing a certain type of analysis to make it, or certain individuals politicize and make certain parts of it have more long-term momentum. So, like, yes, stuff comes into Halifax, there is no doubt, but I also think that is a broader question than just small town Nova Scotia stuff. Sorry, no.
It's interesting to me because this is like, a lot of the people here are from Toronto and Montreal, right in the front row. But there's a way in which like these small cities are
Not by
also.
accident.
We actually talk to each other, yeah.
A lot of these small cities are where there's left organizations growing, and it's very admirable the way Solidarity Halifax uniquely, in some ways, has been able to build organization in a city of that size.
Yeah.
And so it nonetheless is like, I think it's like an actual real thing.
In terms of, I will know more, because I think maybe I can address both of your questions about social movements responding and also lessons from the past. Maybe I will know more is a way I can talk about that. Solidarity Halifax could not implicate itself in I don't know more, right? And actually, I'm not familiar with sort of like the level of familiarity in the US
That's what I was
with I
saying.
don't know
Explain a
more.
bit about I will know more.
Sure. So, oh really? Okay.
I am also in the UK, I should know, but.
So I Don't Know More is a grassroots Aboriginal movement that basically sprung up, was in late November, early December, is that right? We'll say. Organized by 3 women in the prairies, in the prairie provinces, 3 Aboriginal women in the prairie provinces. 4? 4. In response to a few things, in response to very concretely a particular federal bill, Bill C-45, an omnibus bill, which radically interfered with First Nations treaty rights. Also in response to, in recognition of the way in which politics happen amongst First Nations people, a sort of dissatisfaction with, an acknowledged dissatisfaction within the chief and band councils, and was within just sort of like young, kind of like reacting to a sense of disempowerment, disenfranchisement amongst young Aboriginal people. It coincided, or it came sort of on the heels of a lot of attention to a particular community called Attawapiskat, a First Nations reserve that had been like wildly, in Canada, First Nations people live in incredible poverty, have no, very little, clean water in many places. Housing is a massive issue, employment is a massive issue, health is a massive issue. A lot of focus was on this community called Attawapiskat last year, and really shone the light on the federal government and also the provincial government's just lack of responsibility to the First Nations people. Idle No More came up from the grassroots and was organized largely through social media, and it was taken up by previously like by people who weren't activists basically in the First Nations communities, and swept across the country in the form of, it was basically a protest movement, and it's still going on now, but it reached its peak around Christmas time when the chief of Attawapiskat also engaged in a hunger strike and went and camped out on an island demanding to meet with the Prime Minister about this legislation. Idle No More expressed itself through protests, demonstrations almost on a bi-weekly basis, round dances, flash mobs, and basically to draw attention largely to this bill, but the sort of colonial history of First Nations people in Canada. And it swept into Halifax, into Nova Scotia in a pretty serious way. So there's about 20,000 Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia. Many are urban Mi'kmaq, but there's also a number of reserves spread across the province. In Nova Scotia, there's 3 young women who decided to become organizers, and they were tirelessly organizing demonstration after demonstration, and reached out to Solidarity Halifax for support. And as an organization, we know sort of that social movements are no sort of replacement for long-term organizations, but by virtue of it being grassroots, by virtue of it dealing with like serious questions about First Nation struggles, by virtue of it being organized by women, by virtue of it being a project of new activists, we implicated ourselves in it. And when we did, we actually sat down with the organizers and said, said, we're an anti-capitalist organization, do you want to be associated with us? Like, that was actually one of the first things we said. And they actually asked us, what is anti-capitalism? And so we had that conversation, and we made it clear, like, who we were and what we stood for, and they were like, yeah, let's do this. And so what we ended up doing was filling in certain logistical and educational gaps that they simply couldn't. These women were like on their cell phones every day just trying to get bodies out in the streets, right? And they identified education as a real gap amongst, basically, education amongst like white settler people. And so the first thing that we did to support them was to organize a teach-in. We did have like a lot of internal debate within the organization because one of the primary focuses of Idle No More was a federal bill, and that's not generally the terrain that Solidarity Halifax works on. But nonetheless, we were like, okay, we need to support this movement. So we organized a teach-in to try and fill a gap that they identified, and we actually invited a member of parliament. That was highly controversial within the organization, to invite a member of parliament to speak to the bill. But we did. We invited various of the organizers of Idle No More. We invited a Mi'kmaq elder who could actually speak and had enough authority within the Mi'kmaq community to actually criticize the chief and band councils. We didn't think that it was our role to get up and do that in a public forum. So we had a number of speakers, basically to fill this kind of educational gap. And we had 450 people come out, which was incredible because people got swept up in this social movement but really didn't know what it was all about. They didn't know the nature of the bill. They didn't know about the colonial history within Nova Scotia and across the country. So Solidarity Halifax responded to a social movement in a way that we thought met the goals of our organization. All the while, we did compromise a little bit. I think we did compromise, a little bit. But when mass movements are happening, we wanted to respond.
What was the end point? Like, to what extent did you realize your goals through that campaign, and what were those goals? Those kinds of, like, when I mean take hold of the situation, is like, it doesn't just pass through you, because it was amazing. There was like 400 people at the event, and then I don't know to what extent the organization feels like it was successful, or, yeah, those kinds of questions.
Yeah, I mean, out of that, we've done a lot since then as well. First of all, we built relationships of trust. We were able to be allies in a way that we thought was responsible. Subsequent to that event, we actually started giving a number of workshops on how to be an ally. When these kinds of things happen, like, there's a real kind of desire from like white people to white organizations to let's have a First Nations person come in and tell us about their struggle, right? And we actively were discouraging, that kind of behavior, and so we took an active role in having meetings on campuses where basically we said, these meetings were specifically for like white settler people, white people of European descent, who benefit daily from like the racism in Nova Scotia, to come and learn how to be an ally, to come out and not try and do anti-oppression work, anti-racism work in a really paternalistic way. So the teach-in, I think, filled a gap, and we were asked to do something. We were asked to fill an educational gap, and we did. And from that, we've maintained our relationships with the organizers. The movement has gone through, since that point, that was early December, the movement's gone through all sorts of different sort of phases. There were secondary hunger strikes. The movement has radicalized a little bit. At a certain point, it sort of became like a movement for everybody, and now it's focused in much more on the political systems within First Nations communities. Maintaining those relationships, continuing to navigate like the various forms this social movement or its struggle is taking. I think that is something that we would consider a success, because too often people jump on progressives will jump on a social movement, and then when it dies, they walk away. Because it's easy to get involved at that point. It's so easy to show up at the demo. Yeah. What's not easy is to actually keep the work going.
Yeah, I wanted to raise the question of your campaign to return the private utility to public hands. I think it's interesting because sometimes left organizations try to have populist campaigns around unpopular causes. So I'm wondering, like, one easy practical question is that actually a popular cause in your experience? And then a more, I suppose, in-depth question would be like, how and why did you choose that as this populist campaign? I think it's interesting that you sort of differentiate it or describe it as such. And then maybe finally, how do you think the anti-capitalist left more broadly should relate to the rollback of the welfare state? And do you see what you're doing as sort of instructive, or does it have limitations?
In Nova Scotia, people are aware that, like, as I think I said, that like the power goes out all the time. Like, I'm from Newfoundland, where the weather's really bad, and we don't get nearly as many power outages as in Nova Scotia. Like, it's kind of a going concern. So there's already, like, people talk about the power company all the time, right? And people respond to rate hikes. Everybody responds to rate hikes, but in particular, people who are living in poverty. So did we get traction amongst like regular Nova Scotians? Somewhat, yeah. because no one likes it when their power goes out and a really expensive power bill in the middle of the winter, when you're trying to feed your family, really sucks. So I think it's a campaign that has broad appeal and legitimately has put the question back on the table in public discourse, like in the media, and also like within the government. Dave and I were talking earlier, and the campaign. One of the virtues of the campaign, it's been through 2 phases. So one was sort of the introduction of the campaign around particularly the rate hikes. The second was around the skating rink. It's now, just last month, we sort of put it to bed for a little while, but it's a campaign that can be sort of woken up, for like an organization with a long-term project. Like the second there's another rate hike, the second, Emera's in the news for, something or other, we can actually wake that campaign up. So I think it's also a campaign with enough broad appeal, and it's not going anywhere, that has like real staying power.
Yeah, I would just like to echo, it's super easy to beat up on Nova Scotia. No one likes Nova Scotia power. It's like you read that sort of comments section and news stories or letters to the editor. No one likes it, unless even the people who work there don't like it in terms of even the management. I think it is like putting Nova Scotia Power under public control the answer. And I would say no, on a personal level, no. And I think, though, it is a strategic campaign, right? Because it allows us to go and talk to people at the level that they're at. So instead of talking about let's call for the sort of workers' control of Nova Scotia Power into collectives or whatever sort of program that we could have around a future power system, which I think are interesting questions to talk about. That's orienting towards our left, and keep in mind, I think we're the 1%, the anti-capitalist left. It's not big, and I don't want to orient. On a personal level, in my interactions, I don't know about everybody else, but I don't necessarily want to talk to always the people on a campaign, to people to my left. I want to talk to people to my right. And it's not necessarily an answer, but it allows us to talk about that stuff and put anti-capitalism back on the agenda. And also you have to remember that the 3 major political parties, even the Social Democratic Party, which is in power, the NDP, refuse to touch this issue. So they've left it open for us to push on this. So what we're pushing against is making the NDP, we're dividing certain parts of the left from the NDP. It's oh, you're social democratic, why don't you then put this back under public control? Because right now it's a monopoly private enterprise, which is crazy. Mm-hmm. And I think on some level this fills in my mind the idea of what is a transitional demand, right? It's very strategic. It's not necessarily an answer, but it opens up a whole bunch of different spaces that if we're coordinated, we can capture and strategize around how to push even further. And I think in the conversations I've been around part of in terms of Nova Scotia Power stuff, it's really easy to devolve totally into populism and be if this is publicized, I don't know, it's put under public control, that your rates will automatically go down and so on and so forth. Well, yes and no. It's a little more nuanced. I think that the idea isn't to just make all these crazy promises that once it's under public control, it's going to be the best power system in the world or something like this. It's still it won't necessarily be super cheap. It won't necessarily stop using Colombian coal that's from sort of companies that murder trade unionists. They won't stop being terrible in the Barbados or wherever. And oh yes, sorry. Like, but the point is, it is a transitional.
I have something that perhaps it's more of a comment than a question, but I feel like everything that has Linda today is like, first of all, it's like almost everybody like sort of surprised, like how do you guys are holding it together without like, you know, and it's because, as you said, I feel that you stuck to strategy and method. But, you know, this event is, the convention is, you know, putting the utopian program on the these are sort of things that would define the question of the left. So there's a real question of sort of, you know, you admitted in the beginning of your talk about sort of, we know there's this crisis on the left globally, and you spoke of the current reconstitution of the left. But your method, your approach of doing this is focusing on strategy and method, which then sort of seems to imply as if you think that the problem with the left has failed historically is because it's failed to properly organize. And it seems like your activity is moving and succeeding to sort of organize and organized, you know, like network those who haven't and hadn't. But there's a real question of whether or not you will come up to the limits. What happens when some of your campaigns start, you know, this momentum that you have starts failing, you have some defeats. When that happens, and what will hold your organization actually through longevity? And when the defeats start settling in and you have to assess them, you have to assess, well, what are really your long-term goals? If like certain kinds of activism are not succeeding. And is this really the solution for the crisis of the left? And I know it's sort of like you have a very particular social like, city size that I'm not, you know, I almost can't imagine, but it seems that you've been very successful to penetrate the scene and to rattle people into certain kinds of activism. And then what? Is the question. And sort of like how will you begin to address the real, like the long-term concerns of the left? Or is it that you believe that the left is about simply organizing the unorganized in a sense, and that is your solution to the present imperfect? Yeah.
I think maybe next year when we come to the convention, we'll be able to update you on that.
Okay.
I would just say, like, you know, from a personal perspective, it's not like I don't think people are opposed to like utopia, imagining utopia and like forming programs. It's just, okay, then how do you go about that? Do you just sit in a room, or does that come from a place of struggle? Does that come through a process and a method? Because I think that it is pretty easy to go and actually just craft a utopian program, but how do you graft it on to actual lived struggle? And I would say that people like, I know that people in Solidarity like want to talk about this stuff and do casually talk about it, but it's a process of how you go about it, I think. So it's not necessarily being, you know, we're just organizing the unorganized and that's it. It's more, you want to talk about the utopia program, but like you have to recognize that, you know, we're small, we're new, we're like in a particular concrete situation, and it maybe it's an evolutionary process.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time.